Welcome back to another episode of Re-Correlated Podcast. I am your host, Natalie Baker, and I am here today with one of our special guests, Jules DiPrima. Allie is not able to join us today, but Jules, if you want to give a brief introduction, we've had you on the podcast before, and I'm happy to have you back to talk about another legal case and kind of break it down. So go ahead and give yourself a brief introduction.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm Jules. I am currently a GRC specialist, and I go back to my roots as a technical project manager for cybersecurity, and as well as my very early career as a paralegal. So I love to have these conversations where my two worlds crisscross, particularly such a large case that's going to impact the way that we look at cybersecurity contracts and vendors for the future. Very excited to see how this plays out, what agreements are made, and how this is going to tip the scales and how laws are written in the future.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting how it plays on how transparent software vendors are truly going to be in the future and like what transparency actually means, because I think a lot of what these claims are based on are things that were said by a lot of people at CrowdStrike after the fact, trying to do the right thing, as in the cybersecurity community, maintaining their reputation as being still, you had to handle it right. In the aspect of the rest of the industry to actually still respect you at the end of this, right? So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that kind of dynamic plays out as well, because a lot of things that were like released as in doing the good faith thing that CrowdStrike did was kind of used against them a little bit in this lawsuit. So I read through the complaint. I know you've probably read through the complaint. Every time I read through this complaint, I find new little things. What were your overall thoughts of it so far?
My overall thoughts are whoever wrote this has a plan and an agenda and wanted to make a point with all of these statements. It's extremely aggressive. There are a lot of claims that we haven't seen evidence for yet. So really looking forward to discovery, looking forward to CrowdStrike's response to some of these claims, and overall, just the understanding of how these programs work and how CrowdStrike functions seems to be not super well understood from the plaintiff's point of view. So really looking to dig into that aspect.
Yeah, I feel, and I know Allie and I had talked about a little bit in our chat that she said it feels like a board member wrote the complaint, and I was like, or was like in control and was like, no, you must put these things in here, and like the lawyer tried to like lawyer it up as much as possible. Overall, the complaint, I just have to say it, the authorized doors is brought up so many times in this complaint, and it just drives me insane. Like, but it's okay. Definitely something that you probably should have had somebody in the industry actually read over for you as a consultant, right? But at the same time, I can see why Delta's upset 100%. I think some of the complaint is solid and probably has enough of the evidence required. Some of it is kind of like a fishing expedition. They're ready to go get some discovery, turned over so that they can prove the claims that they're making. What are your thoughts on like that aspect of it?
I found really interesting in a few of the counts, there are statements made that CrowdStrike was aware of what was going to happen. They were aware that if they pushed updates, they were going to cause problems, and that they failed to exercise due diligence, which makes sense, but it also brings the topic of the balance that you have to have between testing and having an incident response plan in place, having all of these fail safes ready to go, and being on the cutting edge of cybersecurity and pushing these things when they need to happen because the threat exists. Just like in the legal field, we see that technology advances way faster than the legal world does, and threats can often come about way faster than we can respond to them or we can be proactive. So we have to respond quickly. And I worry that, rigorous testing is important, but how rigorous until it becomes a burden. And it's really about finding that really nice balance between protecting systems and also, getting things out there when they're going to be most effective.
Yeah, and how do we snapshot that for like compliance at an in point time when everything's so dynamic, right? You have machines, like you have load balancing, and like there's always tons of noise whenever you have a load balancer involved, just because like resources are spinning up, they're spinning down, they're spinning up, they're spinning down, depending on the load and the balance that needs to have to maintain like optimal functionality. So at the same time, like getting some better ways and better technologies of like creating that trail that you need, that documentation trail. So I do want to talk about, there's a lot of places in the complaint where they're talking about like kernel level processing versus user level processing. And I know you kind of brought it up, like it makes me wonder if the person that wrote the complaint, or that, if they really understood how the software works and all the functionality and features, because there's no doubt that CrowdStrike did need to run at the kernel level to be able to perform all the functionality that it is able to perform.
Right.
Like when you're looking at like memory protection and stuff like that, that's all kernel level. So yeah, you kind of do need kernel level like privileges. And it kind of seemed like they thought that the driver was being updated all the time. Did you get that in that complaint? What were your thoughts?
I didn't come across that, or I didn't make that same kind of opinion as you did. It's interesting. Do you have like the section of the complaint where that came about?
Oh.
Or tell me more about your thoughts on it.
I do. Let me find the paragraph quick. So where they're talking about like the Windows Hardware Quality Lab, so like paragraph 24 through like 27, like it seemed like they thought that the drive, like the hardware drive, the kernel driver was being updated, the driver package, rather than like the actual like software went through an update.
Okay.
Because like you wouldn't necessarily have to, I wouldn't think that they submit every single time and get Microsoft to then independently validate every single time they have to push like a software update.
Right. So a big, a big system behavior in the kernel was launched and it was there, but we all know that all software needs to be updated regularly and pushed regularly. And it would be incredibly cumbersome for Microsoft, for CrowdStrike, and for the customers to have to go through an approval every single time. And I imagine that there are processes in place to cover that, to test for that, to roll back for that. It sounds like this one kind of just was squeezed through the cracks or unauthorized.
Failed to adhere to policies and procedures. This is why policies and procedures are so important, people. And following what you say you're doing as much as you can. Like there are always going to be those exceptions where you have to do, it's not necessarily like you have to go outside of what your procedure is, but there might be certain aspects of that procedure that just don't fit that scenario. And that's okay, because you have to use your expert judgment in those scenarios. And that's why you're in that position. But you do have to read your policies and procedures.
Right. That brings up a great point. The experts in this field are the CrowdStrike experts who are doing this work. And there's a reason that all of these companies don't have their own, full service in-house cybersecurity. It's because it's so incredibly intricate, and there's so much to it that it would hinder their ability to be a business. And for them to say that these weren't approved updates, I wonder who at Delta would be more qualified to approve these updates than the folks at CrowdStrike, and what would have changed if it had been reviewed beforehand. So it's really interesting to see like where that shared responsibility of whose responsibility really is it to make sure that these updates are going to be successful. How much of that lands on the provider, how much of it lands on Microsoft, and how much lands on Delta themselves.
Yeah. Well, and they did say, and a couple times throughout, that they did have it to where the automatic updates were disabled. Like Delta they have a whole cybersecurity department, right? So like they do have they're a big Fortune 500, company. So they do have a whole cybersecurity department, and they did have that disabled, but there was like an override by CrowdStrike that pushed through. And I can see that I'm being upset by that, because I'd be really upset by I've gotten rid of antivirus vendors before because of that reason. They pushed an update and I did not approve it. And like when you go through the thought process of putting your own configuration management in place and your change management, making sure that changes are approved and that you're rolling changes out slowly so it's not affecting your whole fleet, and then something happens, a vendor overrides it and it pushes to your whole fleet, it makes you really mad. Because you put all the safeguards. And I think that's going to be the biggest area that Delta has the biggest bite at, is they had that disabled. They will have to probably show that they had it disabled since then, but and that they were rolling that out in staged deployments, but that shouldn't be hard to show. And as long as that is the case, then that's probably the biggest claim, because that is the biggest product defect, was that there never should have been an update forced that customer wasn't able to approve because they didn't have those automatic updates enabled. Because that was my first, before I read this complaint, my first take was, well, they should have had change management in place for all those agents and not allowed it to just deploy massively across all their fleet. And then turns out they did have it disabled, as far as the complaint states. We'll find out. I guess maybe one day. Maybe, probably not.
What are your thoughts on Delta's risk appetite? Because we all know that, companies, they accept risks all the time. They understand that perhaps, CrowdStrike might have a little bit more cutting edge technology that's not as well tested or, as true as some of their older updates. What level of risk acceptance do you feel where does that come into play?
I think it comes into play the number of days that they were down and out of operation, and the number of flights that they couldn't take off, that they couldn't have landing. And they lay it out in the early stages of their complaint, where they're talking about all the awards that they've won for having the most on-time flights. And like, that's what was put at risk for almost a week, right? It was like 5 days.
Yeah.
And to them, that's probably where that killed their reputation, that as an airline, that killed a lot of their chances at getting awards this year and winning more awards. And and they do go back to being back in 2018 and so it's been a long time coming. Everybody that flies Delta, the reason you fly Delta is because they will get you there on time, and you're going to be pretty as comfortable as you can be on an airline, right? They do cater to you, right? But you pay a higher price and a higher premium on that plane ticket for that reason. And so I'm sure the prices of plane tickets have probably had to go down a little bit.
I mean, I haven't noticed. I fly Delta, but maybe they have.
I have no idea.
What are your thoughts on customer control? Should Delta have been able to go back in and roll this back on their own? And where do we draw that line? That would have been an interesting kind of point.
With the way that you couldn't just, ideally I'd like to say yes, but then I also want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they probably never planned for something to blue screen of death all the machines.
Right.
Because they had the change control in place with the agent rollout. So I want to. What was the question again, Jules?
Where does the customer control priority come into this? Whereas, say a vendor pushes an update and the customer doesn't like it, should they be able to just go in and roll it back themselves?
I think that was like impossible for this because of it all blue screening and death and needing to be like manually restarted and being on site. And I don't think that Delta ever really prepared for that kind of scenario. Now there are ways of doing it to where you could have like VDIs that you could just spin up new VDIs and assign them to those machines. And then that would have been, a way of doing it. But that's like, I'm not sure that that's fair to say that Delta should have had that in their like contingency planning. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm thinking in the future, really, is this going to change the way that companies and their vendors work together? I can see, cybersecurity departments working with their vendors in a different manner, where they have kind of the final say in what gets pushed, and things get approved or, they're prepared to roll back at the drop of a hat. And how does that look in the future where, there's, I guess, a split between, what the vendor thinks is appropriate and what the customer thinks is appropriate at the time.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see this like shifting a lot with like supply chain and being able to control your supply chain and being able to monitor that supply chain very closely. And having that knowledge of like when something is going to be pushed and having the overall say is like, yes, we want this pushed to these machines, and like being able to go in and actually approve it. And I think even like FedRAMP is kind of pushing towards that, having that control in place to where like, if they want to push it, they can, but like, you're not going to push it across like an entire command all at once or across like an entire agency all at once. You're going to do it in a controlled manner.
Yeah, agreed.
What are your thoughts?
As someone who's worked in not only in cybersecurity, but in application development and integrations development and everything, it's such a fight between, going fast and doing things the right way. As security people, we are always, on the side of doing things the right way. And I wonder, where the pressure comes for why did these updates get pushed without testing? What caused this? Where was the pressure coming from? Because, I've worked in non-security companies where, the customer wants something done and we haven't tested it, but we don't really have a choice. And we go ahead and push it, and things happen that we probably could have avoided. And where do we draw that line?
Yeah. Because I remember, we've all had this, my sysadmin days, man. Those were some good old days where you just like would go rogue with something, push it to production, and like you tested it out on your machine, but that doesn't mean you tested it in your environment. So like, yeah. And then learning lessons from that. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned out of this, in that aspect, to see like what actually comes of it, and to see if things kind of change in like how that information can kind of be utilized of what you're giving, like what you guys are like, it's a partnership, right? Like your vendors should be your partners, and like how you can kind of collaborate better. And I think that we might see some interesting ways of like collaboration coming out of it between that dynamic. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's always such a big fight. That's kind of a mystery for me. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens. I'm really not sure.
Yeah. I was also wanting to kind of go through like the different counts that they have. And if anybody has any questions in the comments, or go ahead, leave them in the comments. If you're on LinkedIn, that's where we're at live. So you can leave all your questions in the comments, but kind of going down the counts count by count, because I think like some of these counts, they're going to have a good, like Delta has a good standing leg on, as long as they can have the proof. And some of it, I feel like they don't have the proof of it yet, but they're working towards that. But some of it, I feel like they kind of went a little overboard. Like, I don't know how, reading through, like as I'm writing all these, there's 9 different counts that they're bringing against them. They don't have a dollar amount that they've set in this document, by the way. So like, they have mentioned that it cost them over $500 million in damages with customer flight interruptions alone, just that alone. So they're looking for a number over that, I'm sure, because they want to send a message. That's kind of what that's how this complaint reads to me, is like, we're here to send a message to our vendors to not mess with us. And like, probably don't be out in the news, and like, don't be accepting awards at DEF CON for like the biggest failure. Like,
yeah, that was a tough one.
How did you like all of that banter at the beginning, with where they were like, I mean, they just went round after round on all the public figures at CrowdStrike, just like I feel like Delta felt like CrowdStrike was making it a joke, and CrowdStrike was just trying to own it.
Yeah, I feel like they obviously they definitely made light of it. The comments by the CEO were interesting, to say the least. But we always have to remember that in cybersecurity, it's when, not if, something happens. So they are particularly well positioned to respond in that way. And yes, it's a huge upset to business, but it I don't want to say something like this should be expected, because it was absolutely shouldn't have been. But cybersecurity experts are prepared to deal with these scenarios, because it does happen, and it happens all the time. And usually companies are much more reactive than Delta is. And I'm actually pretty impressed with how Delta's been handling it on their end, and how they had all of the policies and procedures in place, assumably that would have covered them. And usually it's the other way around. And we're seeing these issues happen on the customer side rather on the vendor side.
Yeah, I would agree. So count one that they have listed out is computer trespassing, with all those unauthorized doors, they have.
That's going to be probably one of the toughest ones, in my opinion, because just inherently CrowdStrike needs access to run and to work as intended.
And when you install it, you give it permission to run, and you agree to the terms of use. All that fine print.
Yeah, so it maybe got the less weighty ones out ahead of them in the beginning of the complaint. But I don't know what evidence that they're gonna be able to produce to prove that. That's gonna be an interesting one. Interested to see what's in their vendor contract about that level of access. Whether it was implied or if it was explicitly stated in their contract might be an arguing point.
Well, so here's the thing, is that they are like kind of alleging that, what it sounded like was that they were alleging that because of how the update affected the root file system, that the driver package updated differently, because there was a different, they updated something with a sys extension file or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then it crashed all the millions of computers around the world, which they make sure they say that a lot. But this is kind of where it was like, it does need to have the memory safety, it needs to be able to update at the kernel level. It makes sense because it has memory protection wrapped into it. That's one of the features you get with those types of XDR tools nowadays. That's my opinion on it. But yeah, I think the computer trespassing is going to be the hardest one to prove, just because I don't think that they're going to actually, I don't think there's a whole lot to prove to that. They would have to prove, but they did say that there was something in their contract about they would not, they specifically called out backdoors, Trojans, yada, yada, unauthorized access. So they did have that in their contract. So I do know, they have something in there, but at the same time, the way that the software works, it would have to update that root directory.
Right.
when it updates.
And we get into, the really fun conversation about language here, because the quote is that CrowdStrike must take commercially reasonable efforts to avoid those things. And what would be commercially reasonable would be that they have access to the part of the computer that they need access to conduct their services. So then we get to argue, what does reasonable mean?
What does that? Yeah. What does that level of access look like? Because I mean, when you run the software, you say yes, give it access. So is that not consent?
Right. And if you say no, then it doesn't work.
It doesn't install.
Right.
It doesn't install. So it fails out. So I don't know. I think that's going to be a hard one. Trespass to personality, which was a little interesting. I don't think this one's got a lot of grit.
This is another area where it refers to the door that they left in the system, repeatedly altering kernel level programming and data. That's all implied based on what CrowdStrike does. I'm interested if you're ready to talk about breach of contract. That's the interesting one in my opinion.
Yes.
What is the level? Oh, go for it.
Where they must take commercially reasonable efforts to avoid the introduction where software is installed any unauthorized backdoor, time bomb, Trojan horse, worm, drop dead device, virus, preventative routines, or other software routines designed to permit access to the use of developed computers by a service provider or a third party not authorized by this agreement. Disable, modify, damage, or delete the customer data and any data, software, computer, hardware, or other equipped, operated, or maintained by Delta, or perform any such similar unauthorized actions. Which that is just so beautifully written by someone who wanted to be very vague yet very specific at the same time. That contract language is very well crafted there. What are your thoughts on this one?
I mean, like I said, really just arguing what that means, because reasonable efforts were likely taken, and it was reasonable that they had to access this part of the computer. I think that is, that's a check mark. It's where it comes in to be unauthorized by CrowdStrike is where you get unauthorized by Delta is where, or by Microsoft is where you kind of get that sticking point. Contractually, yes, they were allowed to have that door open because of the software needed to run. Where then it continues and you get into perform any similar unauthorized actions. So where is the authorization level? Where's that line drawn between what they're authorized to do and what they're not authorized to do? I think that they had access to it was totally fine. It's just that they didn't get approval.
Yeah, and I think the fact that Delta had the automatic updates turned off is where that's going to bite them the most, because they had it turned off. So they said, we did want to know so that we could push it out. And CrowdStrike just overrode that. And they said, no, we're pushing it out anyway.
Right.
That's not what they said, but that's what happened inadvertently.
Right. One of my favorite lines in this is under the breach of contract count, and it's that CrowdStrike knew that its actions would likely cause Delta substantial harm. And I'm just wondering what the response is to that. Yeah,
that's kind of some of the small. That's what's so funny about this. It's like those little jabs there, and it's like, okay, so do you think that CrowdStrike really thought yes, let's push this update that's going to destroy everybody's machines?
Yeah,
on a Friday. Let's blue screen to death everybody's machines on a Friday. That sounds epic. And by the way, even if they have auto updates installed, let's just turn it off. That's what it means to intentionally do that. And I just don't see that meeting the burden at all.
No, not at all.
Intentional misrepresentation and fraud by omission is count 4. So I think that's also going to be hard to prove.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you get down to line 83 of the complaint, CrowdStrike made the following misrepresentation during its sales pitches, which is always a fun stage of the.
I'm sure there's some lesson learned for some salesperson in this here, but like at this. CrowdStrike did not take shortcuts. I can't really prove right now. Like, I have not seen any proof that they took a shortcut. Like, I think something happened. That's the thing that I think that a lot of people kind of seem to forget is that, like, there's still people that work at CrowdStrike, right? Like, it's not run by computers. Like, it's not self-sufficient, like, company. There's people that work there. People are going to make mistakes. And, like, wow, could you imagine being the person that made that mistake and being the person that it comes back to, like being the person that pushed that out that way?
Yeah, who approved this merge is going to be a big question.
Yeah.
And then in the same breath, a couple lines down, we get back again to CrowdStrike has built dangerous doors into the OS, as if it was intentional. And if those doors were actually built by CrowdStrike, is a very interesting way to put it. And it says that they exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft, and that this wasn't the way that they just function as a company. It's that they purposely saw a vulnerability and exploited it in order to push an update, which is just such an interesting, malicious thing to allege.
Yeah. This whole complaint read like, like when you're like, you have an ex or something and they like keep rushing back into a room, you just broke up with them and they keep rushing back in there like, oh, and another thing, and you're like, just go away, like, can you please just stop? Like, that's how this whole complaint read, like the whole way through. It's like, oh man, you're just making it worse for yourself. But like, yeah, no, some of it, it's like I can see where they could get, maybe, I don't think that there was any intentional misrepresentation from CrowdStrike. I'm sure that there's documentation out there that is before this ever happened that was like, here's how our software actually works. And if you read that documentation, it would make sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, honestly, this doesn't appear malicious. This doesn't appear to be sneaky. This appears to be a mistake. Which is obviously why Delta's CrowdStrike CEO came out and owned up to it. It's just a very interesting read to see that this was written as if it was on purpose.
Yeah, it really does read that way. Also, their document formatting is terrible. I just have to say. They need to get help with that. But so count 5 and 6, I kind of want to push them together because they're going to be very similar. Strict liability product defect, I think we can all agree that's probably going to have some.
That's going to stick,
yeah. And same with gross negligence. I think that there's no way that CrowdStrike can really argue that they didn't have some type of gross negligence.
There's so many layers. The fact that it wasn't an approved push, the fact that it was pushed to so many customers or so many systems at once, the fact that it took so long to fix, there was no rollback plan in place. I mean, that's going to be a tough one to fight, and I would be surprised to see how hard CrowdStrike pushes back.
Yeah. And then the count 7, deceptive and unfair business practices. I think that's going to be probably one of the harder ones to really prove, because I think that they don't have that proof at this point from what I've read in the complaint. That's one of those ones that they're just like, we just want to stick it to you. Because you can't be grossly negligent and then be deceptive and unfair at the same time. I feel like.
Yeah. If you're negligent, that, implies that it was a mistake or an accident. Whereas, we hear a lot in this complaint that it was purposeful. So they're going to have to pick one to fight for. And I assume it's going to be the gross negligence because obviously, I don't think there's anyone out there that believes CrowdStrike did this on purpose.
Yeah. And then attorney fees, and then count 9 being punitive damages. Just they feel that they need to be punished worse than what they've already been punished or being punished for everything else that they incurred. So, and punitive damages, I mean, it really just depends on how many of those other counts they can really get to stick. I don't think with a gross negligence, you're going to get punitive damages necessarily. Unless it's like, I mean, it might be like a total award of $500 million to kind of, I don't think this will ever go to court, honestly. I think
it's going to settle 100%.
Oh yeah, no, this will never hit the daylight of a court. There's a couple ways I could see CrowdStrike responding to this. I could see, and I'm sure they probably already have. I have not looked for that, I did look for it. I just haven't found it. But that will be something that we could maybe have another episode on. But I'm sure that CrowdStrike is going to respond and probably ask to strike a bunch of they're going to say, well, some of this is just, them being vexatious.
Right. And we all know how lawsuits work, right? You're going to ask for way more than what you expect with the hope that you'll get at least enough to cover the damages. And that's really what I expect. I don't think CrowdStrike is going to fight very hard. I think, like I said, they know they made a mistake.
I don't think they're going to give Delta what Delta is asking for settlement because they would have already given it to them. I think there's going to have to be a lot that comes out in discovery for them to give them the full $500 million that they wanted, because they would have already done that. They would never even bothered getting into litigation with Delta, because there's settlement offers before you even get to litigation. There's we can settle now for this much, and that's all we'll ever come after you for, and then we'll release you of everything else. And then usually the reason you go to court is because you want more. And there was no offer. The offer just was said no. And I know that I had read Delta had gone to CrowdStrike and asked for the $500 million.
Oh, do we know that they asked for? Are they asking for the $500 million?
Oh no. I'm sure now they're not. They don't even have a number in the complaint that they're asking for. I'm sure they're asking for a lot more, because I'm sure that when they went to CrowdStrike originally, and CrowdStrike said no, we're not giving you the $500 million. And they said that's fine, we'll sue you. Now they want more. That's why the complaint reads the way it does, is because they've already tried to settle out of court first, and CrowdStrike said no.
I'm so interested to see what the dollar figure is going to be.
Yeah, I think we will never know what the dollar figure is of what the actual settlement is. I think we could. I would say CrowdStrike might go up to $100 million, maybe. That'd be a huge settlement. I would say it's going to be probably between 50 to 100 mil in damages for settlement, which is a fraction of what damages Delta claims to have suffered. But
where do you think this all falls with cybersecurity insurance?
Well, I think that...
Was it a cybersecurity incident?
It wasn't, though. No.
Right. It wasn't.
And here's the thing, is that in the complaint it says a cyber incident, right?
Right.
A cyber event.
It says it was never the biggest cyber event in history.
A contingency event. It was a big, widespread contingency event, but it was a contingency event created by your supply chain. So it's actually a supply chain risk management prevention type of control that was subdued, right? That was not implemented. What are your thoughts about that? It's scary. Like your supply chain could really do that.
Yeah. Oh man, it's just such a scary thought, that something so small in the big picture of things can have such a drastic impact on this company and so many other users. And where do we go to prevent this now, outside of trusting that your vendor is going to be responsible? And then we have, better vendor management practices. Are we also going to see a change in the way that vendor contracts are written and what liability they accept when you come into an agreement with a vendor? Is there going to be things written into your contract that says, if we breach something in this contract, we will automatically cover some kind of certain damages, we'll automatically have some kind of system in place to move forward? And our company is going to demand that from their vendors. What's it going to look like? And who has the upper hand there is also really interesting, because CrowdStrike is the leader and their stocks are almost back to where they were before this happened. So who is going to make those calls?
Yeah, I think that like people forget that like at the end of the day, like you still have a human element in it, as long as you have human workers that are doing things. So like there's only so much that you can plan and prepare for. And then when things don't go to that way, I think that you have compliance in place to kind of make sure that you're continuously doing what you need to be doing. I think you'll see a lot more continuous monitored and developed, and you've been seeing it develop into new standards, new frameworks and stuff like that, or being implemented more into different aspects and in different controls, where now you're having to provide, quarters worth of artifacts for many different controls. Like it's not just a matter of having a continuous monitoring plan, but actually like what controls you're monitoring continuously and the frequency at which you're monitoring those. So I think we'll see that happening a lot more. I'd like to see how it kind of impacts CI/CD pipelines and like more secure development practices and like testing your development before you push it out.
Like, wouldn't that be wonderful to see across the board?
Like I can't imagine how easy it would have been for them to have spun up a Windows machine in a VDI, or like, in the cloud even, and then like spun up a Linux machine and then push the updates to those machines and, seen what they actually did, because they would have noticed that the Windows machine blue screen to death, probably.
Yeah. And why didn't they? Is it not already written into their practices? Did someone just break policy? There's so much that we're never going to know.
Yeah, it will. I wish we could find the actual response, because I feel like I'd like to see how CrowdStrike responds. Like, I feel like they could come out of the gate and like just like try to get some of it struck, and I'm sure they're going to do that anyway. They're going to try to get the accounts that like make absolutely no sense struck, and be like, look, you can't go for gross negligence and then in the same breath say that we were, maliciously deceptive and stuff. Like,
you gotta pick one.
Make your choice, be sure about it, but like you gotta, and like then like computer trespassing, I think that goes away if it's gross negligence too, because again, it wasn't intentional.
Has Microsoft responded at all? I can't remember if I read anything in either of these with any statements from Microsoft, but that would be interesting to read.
I don't know. Like, and that's the other piece, is like, if CrowdStrike really did have an exploit that they were using that was a true backdoor into Microsoft system that Microsoft was unaware of, I'm pretty sure Microsoft would have sued CrowdStrike by now for breach of contract and agreements, right? Like,
yeah.
In the
end, it's their operating system.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure something would have happened by now. So like, well, I mean, maybe not by now. They might be working on collecting the evidence. I guess like that could be a realistic ordeal. But yeah, it would be interesting to see how that kind of shakes out, because they're the ones that really have the say of being like, you were not authorized to do this.
Right.
I do know there was another lawsuit that was filed, but it was like a class action lawsuit, and Delta doesn't want to be a part of that.
That's interesting.
Do you want to know why?
Yeah.
Because the minute it's a class action lawsuit, if they find other, like, in there, it's like Plymouth County Retirement Association individually and on behalf of all others similarly situated. Once they get a settlement from that, they have to split it between anybody who comes forward saying that they were affected. Delta's like, no, we want all the settlement for ourselves.
we need to make that money back.
Yeah. And they also went for misrepresentation and omissions during the class period. Well, I don't know what that means. Class period. What's the class period? Anyway. So how do you think, after seeing some of the press releases and seeing how CrowdStrike kind of responded to media and stuff, and then seeing how some of that kind of got taken from statements that they released and kind of twisted around into this complaint against them, do you think that it would have been wise for CrowdStrike to maybe have done a risk assessment before they went and spoke publicly about it?
I think it's probably, as a rule of thumb, always a good idea to maybe, get your ducks in a row before you speak on stage in front of, millions of viewers. But when we bring up, again, the fact that we're going to talk about negligence or we're going to talk about malicious actions, them accepting responsibility and coming forward about it being a mistake could set them up to just take the fall for the negligence portion and in the end have a much smaller sum to pay out. So it could have been strategic.
Yeah. And I think that that's really what's going to help them the most, is that how transparent they were is going to be the way that they're able to minimize the damages as much as possible. But at the same time, I think that maybe not being as lighthearted about it and I don't think they probably shouldn't have accepted the award at DEF CON. And I understand they wanted to save face and reputation within the cybersecurity industry, because we are the people that are yes, this is a good tool, this is a known tool, blah, 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 blah. And making those recommendations up to higher ups in our companies and other companies. But I think that kind of is probably what put a bad taste in Delta's mouth. And I think that probably, if I was their customer and they were out there accepting that award, and it was right after, it was the timing of it, I think, that caused the most friction. Because it was July 19th when the world blew up from CrowdStrike.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was in August when they accepted the worst failure.
Yeah, August 6th. So I don't think that there's any world that exists where that CEO went rogue and made that statement. That CEO would have been immediately consulted by all of the attorneys in CrowdStrike's realm. And I think that statement was on purpose.
Yeah.
I think that leaving a bad taste in people's mouths was something that they accepted to get ahead of this a little bit, knowing that there was going to be a lawsuit, that this was going to be huge. And I think that it positioned them appropriately, even though it was kind of in bad taste, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I don't have any personal problem with how it was handled. But I also wasn't using CrowdStrike, and I was not affected by that whole thing. So my computer didn't blow up, right? So I didn't have any skin in the game. Had my computer blown up, I probably would have been what's going on?
Yeah, I would have been just as mad as I get if I have an automatic update push on a Monday morning and I have a meeting to attend and I can't get into my computer.
Yeah.
But I think that CrowdStrike's acting a little bit more strategically than what it appears to be at first glance.
Yeah. I would agree. And I think that their response is going to probably be a very strategic response as well. I feel like they've probably brought their lawyers in pretty early on.
I assume immediately, yeah.
Yeah. They were like,
I can see the boardroom and the
Yeah.
panic and all of the lawyers and the stakeholders in there freaking out. I'm sure it happened the same day.
Yeah. What are your final thoughts, kind of wrapping this episode up? We're coming up. I guess we have 10 minutes. So do you have any other topics that you want to talk about, or any other aspects of the complaint that you kind of want to talk about?
My final thoughts are, what is this going to do for the overall trust in the cybersecurity industry? CrowdStrike are the leading experts in the field, and this was a huge misstep if that is what it comes to be. Cybersecurity experts and security personnel already kind of are the ugly stepchild in the tech arena, and I'm very curious to see how the culture shifts following this. I think it's absolutely gonna shift, especially with, like you said, vendor management and supply chain management, and just how CrowdStrike is going to be referred to in the future. What's it going to do to cybersecurity as a whole?
Yeah, I am of the opinion that I don't think CrowdStrike's going to go anywhere. I think it was a huge. They are an industry leader. They still are. Like you said, like their stock price is almost back up to where it was. Like, and it's been what, like 3-4 months. Like that's a really quick turnaround. And it's because of how they did respond in the media. So like, I do agree. Now, there were some other bold claims made by some other vendors in that complaint, but which is rich. But I do think that there's a lot of good that comes from it. But you also have to remember that, like, you can only prepare for so much, and you can't take every scenario into account every single time, right? So, like, you also have to remember, like, they are like my favorite paragraph in this complaint was like paragraph 32, and they're like, CrowdStrike claims to be externally validated and accredited. And I go on the FedRAMP website marketplace, and I'm like, oh nope, they are externally validated and accredited. They absolutely are. So like I could also see CrowdStrike kind of, I mean, I don't think they would, but this lawsuit, the way that it was filed and written, with like all like the nasty snide comments and allegations in there, like they could be borderline defamation of character of CrowdStrike, because of all the things that they allege with like it being intentionally done, and like all the intentional, and then like in the same breath saying that it was negligence.
That's something I meant to bring up earlier. Is there going to be like a counterclaim here? Which would be so interesting to see play out. I don't think that there's going to be.
I don't
like
think
you said, it's going to settle. But in a world where this went to trial, wow, that would have been so fun to watch.
Can you imagine if like CrowdStrike just was like, F it, we're gonna just get a trial on this one. We'll settle the class action. If they don't want to join it, that's on them. Just get this one a trial.
Take on Delta head on for a mistake that they probably just made.
But I mean, yeah, so I think that, I don't foresee that it's ever going to go to trial. That's unfortunate for all of us. It's not going to be the next Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial.
Unfortunately for us.
Unfortunately, because that was so entertaining.
Man, biggest lesson learned? Like, how about we talk about like progressive rollouts? Maybe that becoming testing, a little bit,
and like testing in a test environment before going to production, maybe. Like me. That could be the biggest lesson I think is learned here, is like testing in your test environment before you roll to prod.
Kind of makes me wish I was still in development, so I could just refer to this every time a deadline gets pushed on me that we're not comfortable with. It's too bad I'm not in that world anymore.
Remember what happened with CrowdStrike?
I can push it, but do you want to be down for a week? that would be a fun conversation to have in my stand-ups.
Yeah. So Yeah, I think probably not rushing and taking your time and practicing due diligence and due care. Because I think that's the other thing that I was surprised was kind of missing from this complaint was a due diligence, due care clause.
Yeah.
Because like I feel like they could get that with gross negligence in the same breath.
agree.
And that would be one would help prove the other actually. And maybe I mean this is in Georgia that it's filed, so maybe in Georgia that's what gross negligence is considered. They would have the same charge for due care, lack of due care and due diligence, but like making sure that you take that time and like also making sure that you're documenting what changes you're making when you make changes to an environment. Have a rollback plan.
I feel like every time we have conversations, we just go back to like the very, very simple basics of DevSecOps.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
And here's the it really is, and it's what it always comes back to when these types of things happen, that it always comes back to very basic conversations that like if somebody in their security team maybe broke it down for the developer side a little bit better and been like, hey, did we do change management? Like, but then sometimes like there is a question as to whether CI/CD falls into change management necessarily, and how that kind of differs a little bit. That could be a separate process in some environments. Usually there's still some aspect of control though, but like who approved that merge, man?
For at the very least, test on a VM. See what happens,
Make sure you're putting notes in your tickets. Simple things. Having a rollback plan before you make a change to your production environment. Yeah.
Yeah, back to basics. Take a look at your policies and procedures and actually do what you say you do. That's really it. And I get so many instances of, going into different environments for customers and reviewing policies and procedures and saying, these all look wonderful. Why aren't you doing it?
You actually do it.
Yeah, like that would solve your problem.
Yeah. Your documentation looks great. Do you actually do these things? Like, well, yeah, we do. Okay. Well, can you give me evidence of this, this, and this? And then they're like, that's when you start to realize and you start to like peel back those layers and you're like, yeah, have you read your documentation yet? Please go read your documentation.
Which
before you make a change, make sure you read your change management documentation. Okay.
I'm interested to see how some of these things just continue to become automated. So it reduces the risk of having manual error in there. We're going to have automated testing and unit tests that just automatically run every time you push a change. And, I think that's the direction all of this is going in.
Yeah. Yeah. But you're still going to have people that approve the change after the testing's been done. And they have to review it. They have to have the know-how. So like, don't just because like you need to review that documentation. Like read it before you sign. I also, the other thing that the last thing I think I found interesting, and maybe it wasn't this one. I thought, they didn't just sue Delta. They also sued the CEO, I think. Like, maybe it was.
Honestly, I lost my first page because I have so many pages of documentation on my desk right now. I didn't notice.
Oh, no, that was the other one, the Plymouth County retirement, the class action lawsuit.
Yeah. Okay.
They also sued they're also going after like individually the CEO and the CFO, I think, or something.
That's interesting. I would like to know the reasons behind why they chose to do
that.
So
I think the class action lawsuit actually is for SEC violation almost.
That's the first count.
And because of the stock prices dropping.
Yeah.
So I think that was more like, yeah. Okay.
That makes sense. Maybe we'll have to have another episode on the class action.
Yeah. Well, that would be interesting. Yeah. Because we might be able to get somebody that knows enough about cybersecurity and enough about like finance. We'll just see. Maybe a future episode. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how it kind of plays out and see at the end what kind of gets automated out, like you were saying, like what processes kind of get automated out from this, and what lessons they actually have learned from this on both sides too, because there's lessons to be learned on both Delta and CrowdStrike's side, I feel.
Oh yeah. I think I'm most looking forward to seeing the CEO's new statement after this is all said and done, because the original statement was great. I can't wait to hear the next one.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see if will be interesting. Well, that is all we have for this week. We're going to wrap it up and leave it here. Next week, we will be back with the final unveiling of the CMMC rule as it stands or stood as when it was last published. Mind you, I know there's been some like litigation filed or like complaints. I don't know how Congress works, but some senators were like, no, we don't want this going into effect. So they were trying to block CMMC, which is really weird. But we're going to bring Jacob Hill back in and talk. So we started our year off talking about CMMC. We're going to end the year talking about CMMC. So that will be in 2 weeks on the 19th. And until then, guys, talk to you later. Have a good one.